Queen Camilla, now facing the daunting and unfamiliar reality of her position as Dowager Queen, has chosen a path of fierce resistance, transforming what should be a seamless, dignified transition of power into a bitter theater of obstruction and open defiance. At the absolute center of this unfolding tempest is a meticulously crafted, highly controversial draft for the upcoming coronation of King William V and Queen Catherine, a sacred ceremony whose planning, in a stunning revelation that shatters public perception, was secretly set into motion long before the late King Charles drew his final breath. This was never a frantic, improvised scramble born from sudden grief. Rather, it was a cold, calculated, and deeply entrenched blueprint forged in the shadows of the previous reign, designed to ensure the unbroken continuity of the British monarchy. Yet, this timeless machinery of state has slammed directly into an unyielding obstacle. A queen unwilling to let go, refusing to perform the mandatory constitutional blessings, and adamantly rejecting the relentless, forward-moving current of history itself. This was not merely a date. It was the moment Britain learned that the future had arrived. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The friction intensified into open hostility when the Coronation Committee presented a draft program containing a clause that fundamentally challenged Camilla's worldview. According to the rigid, centuries-old liturgical blueprint, the Dowager Queen was required to step forward during the solemn proceedings to offer a public blessing to the new sovereign, accompanied by the ceremonial presentation of a powerful historical symbol, traditionally a crown, coronet, or signet representing the peaceful surrender and transference of supreme royal authority to the new generation. For Camilla, this requirement felt less like a constitutional formality and more like an intolerable humiliation. To her, standing before her own stepson and millions of glaring television cameras across the globe to hand over the mantle of power was an unpardonable indignity. She viewed the directive not as a tribute to the crown, but as a personal affront orchestrated to diminish her legacy. In a fit of bitter indignation, she lashed out, demanding that her entire presence and the mandated blessing be completely scrubbed from the coronation program. She convinced herself, in a towering rage, that she was the victim of a coordinated, malicious plot, a predatory scheme hatched by Prince William, Princess Catherine, and the formidable Earl Marshall, Edward William Fitzalan Howard, to systematically isolate, corner, and subjugate her while the memory of King Charles was still fresh in the public consciousness. This fierce defiance immediately collided with an immovable force of British institutional history, the Earl Marshall of the United Kingdom, His Grace Edward William Fitzalan Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. For centuries, generation after generation of the illustrious Howard family has held this hereditary office, serving not merely as courtiers, but as the supreme master builders and absolute directors of state coronations, royal funerals, and state openings of parliament. The Earl Marshall does not bend to the fleeting emotional storms of royalty. He is the ultimate guardian of protocol, charged with safeguarding the structural integrity and historical continuity of the British crown. When Camilla attempted to derail the proceedings and cast aside the sacred blessing, Lord Edward did not offer polite diplomatic evasions. With the unyielding authority vested in his office for hundreds of years, he openly and severely rebuked the Queen, launching into a blistering critique of her personal vanity. He accused her of staggering selfishness, warning her that her desperate attempt to rewrite history was a direct assault on the constitutional bedrock of the nation. With absolute composure and chilling directness, he informed her that the monarchy does not bend to accommodate the wounded pride of individuals, and that her refusal to step aside gracefully was an insult to the memory of the institution she purported to serve. The paradox that has gripped the palace corridors and left court insiders utterly breathless is how a reigning queen could be brought so low as to be forced into a humiliating apology to Catherine, all under the crushing weight of royal discipline and the unassailable authority wielded by the Earl Marshall. How is it possible that a hereditary peer could openly lecture and reprimand the queen consort without violating the sacred protocols of the realm? The answer lies in the ancient, unwritten constitution of the monarchy, where the Earl Marshall holds supreme jurisdiction over all matters ceremonial, superseding even the personal whims of reigning or dowager monarchs when the preservation of the state is at stake. Lord Edward's power is rooted in a tradition older than the Tudor dynasty itself, giving him the unique, untouchable prerogative to enforce order, correct protocol violations, and speak absolute truth to power, regardless of who holds the royal title. When Camilla attempted to bypass his authority and cast aspersions on the integrity of the incoming king and queen, the Earl Marshall stood his ground, backed by the unshakable resolve of William and Catherine, who refused to allow personal sentimentality to compromise the future of the nation. Caught between the immovable pillar of constitutional law personified by the Howard family and the inevitable tide of a new reign, Camilla found herself utterly cornered, forced to confront the bitter reality that her era had officially ended and that the crown would march forward with or without her blessing. The absolute chaos within the private quarters of the palace escalated from mere constitutional disagreements into a vicious, deeply personal family war the moment Camilla decided to drag her own family into the inner sanctum of state administration. Seeking to fortify her crumbling position and desperately searching for allies who would validate her grievances against the incoming sovereign, the Dowager Queen took the unprecedented and highly irregular step of bringing her daughter, Laura, directly into a classified, high-level strategic planning meeting concerning the coronation. This was a severe breach of protocol, as unauthorized individuals are strictly barred from entering the inner sanctum, where the fate of the British Empire is meticulously mapped out by sworn officials and senior statesmen. Laura marched into the chamber with an air of unwarranted entitlement, completely unequipped with the political subtlety required for such weighty affairs, and immediately began making aggressive demands regarding her family's status and seating arrangements for the historic event at Westminster Abbey. With a brazen disregard for the established hierarchy that has governed the British court for centuries, Laura audaciously insisted that her family be granted a preeminent seating tier and ceremonial prominence precisely equal to that of Prince Edward and his family during the coronation of the late King Charles, arguing that such a concession was the bare minimum owed to her bloodline to preserve their elevated standing in the royal ecosystem. The reaction from the guardians of the realm was swift, merciless, and utterly devastating to Camilla and her daughter. Edward William Fitzalan Howard, the Duke of Norfolk and hereditary Earl Marshall, did not hesitate for a single second to crush this insolent breach of protocol with the full, unyielding force of his ancient office. With a voice that cut through the tense silence of the room like a sharp blade, the Earl Marshall rebuked Laura for her sheer audacity, pointing out with blistering precision that she possessed no official standing, no constitutional role, and no right whatsoever to dictate terms to the crown. Furthermore, he launched a fierce critique against Camilla for allowing her daughter to act as an uncredentialed secretary during confidential state affairs, noting with severe disdain that even legitimate permanent secretaries were strictly bound to their duty of recording minutes silently rather than voicing personal demands or attempting to manipulate the governance of the realm. When Laura attempted to argue back and defend her disruptive intrusion, the Earl Marshall exercised his supreme authority over all ceremonial and household proceedings without a moment of hesitation. He immediately summoned the royal security guards, ordering them with absolute finality to physically escort Laura out of the chamber and ban her permanently from all future planning sessions. This dramatic and humiliating expulsion sent shockwaves through the entire royal household, serving as a brutal reminder that personal entitlement holds zero currency when weighed against the immovable pillars of British constitutional tradition. Prince William observed this disgraceful spectacle with cold, unyielding resolve, recognizing instantly that his stepfamily was actively attempting to sabotage the transition of power out of sheer desperation and bitterness. With the heavy burden of the impending crown resting upon his shoulders, and the memory of his father's recent passing still casting a solemn aura over the palace, William refused to tolerate any further obstruction or disrespect directed toward the future of the institution. Stepping forward with the quiet authority of a reigning monarch, William officially endorsed the decisive actions taken by the Earl Marshall and formally ordered the immediate removal of all non-essential personnel from the planning committee, effectively locking out anyone who sought to weaponize personal relationships for political leverage. He made it crystal clear that the coronation of himself and Queen Catherine would be conducted with absolute integrity, absolute discipline, and absolute adherence to historical protocol, completely purging the administrative process of the toxic entitlement that Camilla and her inner circle had tried to inject into the proceedings. This decisive display of strength finally shattered the illusion that the incoming reign could be manipulated or bullied, establishing an ironclad boundary that forced every courtier, official, and royal family member to acknowledge that a new era had officially begun under entirely new rules. The bitter fallout from the expulsion of Laura sent violent shockwaves through the private apartments, leaving Queen Camilla isolated, cornered, and burning with a deep sense of betrayal. She directed her intense fury not only toward the unyielding Earl Marshall, Edward William Fitzalan Howard, but also directly at Prince William and Princess Catherine, convincing herself in a blind rage that the three of them had formed an unholy alliance to humiliate her and strip away every vestige of her influence while the soil on King Charles's grave was still fresh. Unable to accept that her decades of painstaking ascent to power were vanishing overnight, Camilla launched a desperate, behind-the-scenes campaign of sabotage designed to undermine the very transition she was constitutionally bound to support. Bypassing the strict administrative channels overseen by the Duke of Norfolk, she took the extraordinary and unauthorized step of contacting the Lord Chamberlain's office directly through private, informal channels. She demanded covert alterations to the official coronation procession documents, aggressively insisting that her role as Dowager Queen be significantly expanded and, most shockingly of all, that she and her personal retinue be granted the privilege of entering Westminster Abbey immediately before William and Catherine, thereby preserving the visual illusion of her superior hierarchical standing from the previous reign. This clandestine maneuver, executed in the dark shadows of palace bureaucracy, was intended to pull the rug out from under the incoming sovereign and present the court with an irreversible fait accompli on the morning of the ceremony. However, Camilla drastically underestimated the meticulous vigilance of Princess Catherine, who had taken it upon herself to personally cross-check every single line of the final procession papers to ensure absolute perfection before public release. Thumbing through the classified state documents in her private study, Catherine's sharp eyes caught the unauthorized alterations immediately, spotting the manipulated entry times and the brazen shifting of the processional order that would have placed the Dowager Queen ahead of the newly crowned monarchs. Rather than creating an explosive public spectacle or running immediately to her husband with grievances, Catherine displayed the cool, calculated restraint of a seasoned stateswoman. She carefully marked the altered pages, closed the heavy leather folder, and instructed her personal secretary to maintain absolute silence on the matter for the time being, knowing full well that a strategic trap needed to be sprung before confronting the architect of this deception. Catherine understood that allowing such an egregious breach of protocol to pass unchecked would permanently compromise the authority of the new reign, signaling weakness to the entire Commonwealth at the exact moment when absolute strength and unity were demanded by the British people. Before the princess could formally confront Camilla with the damning evidence, the news of the clandestine scheme reached the iron ears of Princess Anne, the formidable Princess Royal, who acted with lightning speed to neutralize the growing threat to the crown. Princess Anne immediately summoned the senior organizers from the Lord Chamberlain's office and issued a blistering, unyielding directive to purge every single unauthorized revision from the state documents, restoring the original, approved procession order down to the very last second. Anne delivered a severe warning to the palace officials, making it crystal clear that any visible sign of institutional fracture or internal jockeying for power during the coronation would be treated as an act of treasonous disloyalty to the British monarchy, capable of destroying the reigns of both her late brother and her nephew in a single catastrophic stroke. When the undeniable proof of Camilla's backdoor interference was finally laid out before the late King Charles's most private records and presented directly to the highest levels of the household, the reaction was one of profound, icy devastation. The exposure of her desperate bid to cling to authority did not protect Charles's legacy as she had foolishly claimed. Instead, it achieved the exact opposite effect, making it appear to the inner circle as though the former monarch had been complicit in an unseemly, pathetic attempt to cling to power from beyond the grave, forever tarnishing the solemn dignity of his final days on earth. The heavy oak doors of the private study remained tightly sealed, locking away the bitter confrontation that unfolded between the former king and the woman who had fought so desperately to shield his fading legacy through unauthorized manipulation. When the undeniable evidence of the clandestine procession alterations was placed squarely upon the mahogany table, the atmosphere within Clarence House turned glacial. King Charles looked down at the revised documents, his expression hardening into a mask of profound disappointment and cold fury. He did not direct his anger at the courtiers or the administrative staff. Instead, he turned his gaze entirely toward Camilla, demanding to know why she had dared to act under his name and subvert the sacred protocols of the realm without his knowledge or consent. Her defense was rooted entirely in raw, unfiltered panic, the paralyzing fear that the moment William ascended the throne, the entire edifice of power, privilege, and recognition they had painstakingly built together over decades would evaporate overnight. Camilla confessed that she genuinely believed palace organizers and the incoming camp were already treating Charles like a ghost, systematically sidelining his historic reign before the final chapter had even been written. She argued that altering the schedule and demanding a privileged entry position was her only remaining weapon to protect his dignity against a ruthless institutional tide that seemed eager to sweep them both into obscurity. Yet, King Charles refused to accept her justification, recognizing with chilling clarity that her panicked intervention had achieved the exact opposite of what she intended. Far from protecting his honor, her backdoor meddling played directly into the most malicious public suspicions, the dangerous narrative that he was secretly clinging to power, unwilling to let go of the crown, and actively conspiring to undermine his own son's rightful accession. The psychological weight of the moment crushed whatever lingering illusions remained between them. With a deliberate and solemn motion, Charles reached down, slid his heavy gold signet ring from his finger, and placed it directly beside the fraudulent coronation papers on the table. He reminded her with quiet, devastating authority that personal symbols and royal insignia become utterly dangerous when individuals begin to value the metal more than the absolute trust that holds the institution together. Crushed by the silent rebuke and the stark realization that her desperate power play had permanently alienated the man she sought to protect, Camilla turned and walked out of the room in total silence. She sat entirely alone in the long, dimly lit corridor outside, watching as senior aides and palace officials passed her by at a careful, respectful distance, refusing to offer a single word of comfort. That profound, chilling silence hurt far more than any verbal reprimand could have ever achieved, serving as an agonizing confirmation that her formidable influence had already evaporated into thin air. Word of this domestic explosion traveled through the palace corridors with lightning speed, eventually reaching Prince William via a formal, documented briefing delivered directly by the household secretary. William's initial reaction was swift and merciless, driven by a protective fury that brooked no compromise. He demanded that Camilla be immediately and permanently barred from attending any remaining planning meetings, state dinners, or preparatory sessions for the coronation. However, Princess Catherine intervened before her husband's anger could crystallize into an irreversible punitive war. With the calm, measured wisdom of a future queen, Catherine warned William that launching their new reign with a campaign of public humiliation and petty retribution would poison the very reconciliation the monarchy desperately needed to survive. She insisted that they could not afford to begin their era by punishing those they claimed to unite, arguing instead for constitutional strength tempered by grace. Recognizing the profound truth in his wife's counsel, William relented, allowing Catherine to handle the delicate matter personally. In a private, tense encounter, Catherine made it unequivocally clear to the Dowager Queen that while her place within the family circle would be respected, her attempts to subvert state administration and manipulate protocol would never again be tolerated. Recognizing she had completely exhausted her political capital, Camilla finally yielded, accepting the ironclad boundaries established by the incoming sovereign and conceding that the future of the British crown belonged entirely to William and Catherine. The weight of the impending crown pressed heavily upon the private chambers, extending far beyond the political maneuvering of the adult court and casting a long, frightening shadow over the most innocent members of the royal family. Prince William and Princess Catherine found themselves confronting a deeply agonizing anxiety that no amount of constitutional preparation could ever truly alleviate. The terrifying realization that the relentless machinery of the monarchy might ultimately devour the childhood of their beloved offspring. The crushing pressure of public scrutiny, unending media speculation, and the inescapable destiny of the throne had begun to seep behind closed doors, threatening to rob George, Charlotte, and Louis of the peaceful upbringing their parents had fought so fiercely to protect. This hidden parental dread materialized with heartbreaking clarity one evening when young Prince George, having quietly absorbed the relentless stream of digital commentary and breaking news playing across a household tablet, approached his mother with eyes wide with genuine terror. He asked her with trembling innocence whether his father becoming king meant that he would permanently lose the comforting presence of his father, and whether the terrifying title of heir would completely strip away his right to ever be a normal child again. That heartbreaking question froze Catherine in her tracks, laying bare the devastating emotional toll that the crown was already exacting upon the next generation before the solemn ceremony had even commenced. Determined to ensure that their children would never be sacrificed on the cold altar of institutional ambition, William and Catherine made a solemn, unyielding vow that transcended all traditional state obligations. On the eve of the coronation, resting quietly beside the formal, heavily guarded draft of the royal oath, the future king and queen took out a private sheet of high-quality parchment and penned a deeply personal revolutionary covenant that would forever alter the ethical foundation of their reign. In this confidential family pledge, William and Catherine explicitly wrote down their mutual promise that regardless of what titles, duties, or constitutional burdens the future might place upon their shoulders, their three children would never be treated merely as functional instruments or breathing propaganda tools for the state. They committed themselves entirely to raising George, Charlotte, and Louis with an unwavering foundation of genuine parental affection, unyielding domestic honesty, and the rare, precious gift of freedom from institutional fear. The children would indeed be thoroughly educated in the heavy demands of public duty and historical responsibility, but they would always be allowed to laugh, stumble, and grow up safely within the warm embrace of a loving family rather than existing as isolated prisoners of the palace walls. This private document represented a radical departure from centuries of cold, detached royal child rearing, proving that the new sovereign and his consort were fiercely determined to preserve their humanity at all costs. With their domestic foundation secured by this powerful vow of parental protection, William turned his attention toward the final reconciliation required to heal the fractured royal household before the eyes of the global public. Having witnessed the profound sorrow and quiet dignity with which his father had ultimately stepped aside, the new king recognized that the transition of power must be sealed not with lingering resentment or bitter recriminations, but with mutual respect and profound historical closure. Following a respectful invitation sent through the senior household staff, the former monarch stepped into the private study to face his son as an equal, ready to perform the final act of constitutional surrender. Resting squarely upon the polished mahogany desk between them lay the official abdication document, the monumental legal instrument that would permanently and irrevocably terminate the reign of the previous sovereign. King Charles looked down at the parchment for a long, contemplative moment, feeling the immense weight of decades of service slipping quietly through his fingers, before picking up a heavy fountain pen and pressing it firmly to the paper. With steady strokes of ink, he signed away the crown, forever sealing his place in the annals of British history. Setting the pen down with a quiet, echoing click, he softly asked his son that history remember his decision, not as a reluctant retreat from power, but as a deliberate, selfless act of protection designed to safeguard the stability of the institution he had served his entire life. Prince William stepped forward without a moment of hesitation, closing the physical and emotional distance that had separated them through months of bitter arguments, and wrapped his father in a deep, powerful embrace. He assured the former king that history would judge his sacrifice with profound honor, recognizing that stepping aside voluntarily, while still fully capable of witnessing the dawn of a new era, was the ultimate expression of royal duty and paternal love. Standing quietly nearby, Princess Catherine stepped forward and gently lifted the signed abdication document from the desk, handling the historic parchment with the utmost care while refusing to summon any outside aides or administrative secretaries, allowing father and son a few precious moments of absolute silence to absorb the monumental reality of what had just transpired. In that quiet room, illuminated by the soft glow of evening lamps, one entire historical era came to its official, peaceful close, while another became an inevitable, unstoppable reality for the British nation. The bitter storms of obstruction, the fierce turf wars waged by courtiers, and the painful domestic clashes that had threatened to tear the family apart were suddenly washed away by a simple, profound display of familial reconciliation. With the sacred bond between father and son miraculously restored and the future of the monarchy firmly secured by an unprecedented promise of love and transparency, the royal household finally stood united, fully prepared to face the global spotlight of a new dawn. The golden summer morning of June 2nd, 2027, broke over London with an architectural splendor that matched the historic gravity of the day, as the towering ancient bells of Westminster Abbey began their majestic chime across the capital, announcing far more than the mere commencement of a new monarchical reign. Those deep, resonating vibrations marked the triumphant and peaceful completion of a profoundly difficult, emotionally taxing promise forged between a father, a son, and the extraordinary woman who had held their fractured family together through its darkest constitutional trials. King William V entered the hallowed nave of the ancient church carrying the crushing, inescapable burden of global expectation, his stride resolute yet tempered by the heavy realization of what his accession had cost the man who walked before him. Walking faithfully by his side was Queen Catherine, radiating a quiet, magnificent strength and an enduring grace that captured the absolute essence of modern royal leadership. Former King Charles arrived not as a defeated ruler nursing hidden bitterness, but as a dignified statesman whose final, selfless act of stepping aside had successfully shielded the British crown from catastrophic institutional collapse. The sight of William and Catherine entering the Abbey hand in hand made the overarching message of the day utterly unmistakable to the millions watching across the world. This would not be a solitary, cold assent to autocratic power, but a genuine, equal partnership rooted in mutual respect, shared responsibility, and absolute transparency. The sacred coronation ceremony, designed to bind the soul of the nation to its sovereign through ancient liturgical rites, placed the future of the British monarchy squarely upon the shoulders of both William and Catherine, cementing their shared vision of a more compassionate institution. In a powerful moment of absolute protocol discipline that quieted every lingering rumor of court intrigue, Charles took his designated place beside Queen Camilla without a single hesitation, completely bypassing the petty grievances of the past. The former sovereign allowed the incoming royal couple to command the absolute center of the liturgical stage, while Camilla, having learned the bitter lessons of her failed power struggles, did not attempt to reclaim the hierarchical prominence she had once feared losing. Her newfound restraint was critically important because a single arrogant gesture or public misstep could have instantly revived every poisonous whisper of bitterness and division that the royal household had worked so tirelessly to extinguish in the weeks leading up to the bells ceremony. The most critical and emotionally charged turning point of the entire service arrived during the formal constitutional pledge, a moment loaded with historical tension that held the breath of the entire global audience. Charles stood tall and proud, looked directly into the eyes of his son, and delivered a clear, steady, unshakable pledge of personal and institutional loyalty to the new sovereign. Those profound words effectively eradicated every remaining speck of doubt across the Commonwealth. The new king briefly and respectfully lowered his head in silent acknowledgement before offering his response, honoring not only a former monarch who had served for decades, but a beloved father whose ultimate sacrifice had made this peaceful, uninterrupted succession possible. Moments later, the Archbishop of Canterbury placed the shimmering crown upon Catherine's head, officially establishing her as the queen consort of the new era. True to her nurturing character, the Queen's very first instinctive reaction upon receiving the crown was not one of cold triumph or detached regal superiority, but a deeply compassionate, reassuring glance toward young Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis seated nearby. Young George appeared visibly overwhelmed by the sheer historical scale and solemnity of the monumental event unfolding around him, but William caught his eldest son's eyes across the sanctuary and offered a calm, reassuring nod, silently reminding the young heir of the sacred private promise they had made that no child of theirs would ever be sacrificed as a mere functional instrument of the state. High above the congregation, Princess Anne watched her brother Charles with a piercing, analytical gaze, finally witnessing a profound physical and emotional tension drain entirely from his face, leaving behind an expression of absolute peace. The formidable Princess Royal understood with absolute clarity that her brother had not lost the monarchy in that sacred chapel. Rather, he had eternally preserved and protected it by possessing the extraordinary wisdom to know precisely when to release the reins of power. Following the conclusion of the formal religious rites, Queen Camilla approached Catherine in the vestry and gently took her hand in a quiet, final gesture of acceptance, acknowledging that her era had drawn to a close while receiving reassurance that a dignified, respected place within the bosom of the family remained fully intact for her remaining years. Stepping out onto the historic balcony of Buckingham Palace beside his radiant wife and children later that afternoon, King William delivered his very first official address to the British nation and the wider Commonwealth, a speech that profoundly honored his father's lifelong service, praised Catherine's unwavering courage through the storms of transition, and expressed profound gratitude for the enduring trust of the public. He solemnly promised a reformed, modernized monarchy built firmly upon the pillars of absolute responsibility, radical openness, and deep societal compassion. As the thunderous cheers of hundreds of thousands of ecstatic citizens rolled across the Grand Mall beneath them, the royal family stood united, not as distant, untouchable figures wrapped in cold institutional myth, but as a genuinely human family that had bravely confronted its deepest internal demons and emerged stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected than ever before. The tumultuous crisis that had threatened to tear the House of Windsor apart had ultimately transformed into its greatest triumph, proving that the true strength of the British crown does not lie merely in ancient titles, golden carriages, or inherited wealth, but in the rare, courageous ability of its members to embrace the relentless current of history without ever abandoning one another.